The Cincinnati Bengals were building real momentum. Back-to-back strong wins had the locker room buzzing, the fan base reinvigorated, and the front office feeling confident about where this team was headed. Then, in a single moment on the field, everything shifted. Joe Burrow went down with a turf toe injury serious enough to require surgery, and just like that, the entire trajectory of Cincinnati's season was thrown into uncertainty. The medical timeline handed down was stark and unambiguous: 12 to 14 weeks of recovery before Burrow could realistically return to game action. That is not a minor setback. That is a franchise-altering development that forces every decision-maker inside the Bengals organization to completely reassess what this season can and cannot be. When a franchise quarterback goes down, the shift inside a locker room is immediate and visceral. The veterans who have built their games around that QB's timing, rhythm, and decision-making suddenly find themselves recalibrating. The receivers who trust his eyes and arm are now looking at each other with unspoken questions. The offensive line, which tailors its blocking schemes to the mobility and pocket presence of the starter, has to mentally reset. For Bengals fans who have watched Burrow develop into one of the most talented quarterbacks in the league, this injury does not feel like a routine bump in the road. It feels different because the history is there. Burrow has now dealt with multiple significant injuries during his professional career, and while talent has never been the question, availability is becoming a conversation that can no longer be avoided in Cincinnati. The NFL has a well-documented pattern of backup quarterbacks stepping into impossible situations and delivering outcomes nobody predicted. Tom Brady replaced Drew Bledsoe in 2001 and went on to win a Super Bowl that same season. Kurt Warner was stocking grocery store shelves before he became an NFL MVP and Super Bowl champion with the St. Louis Rams. Dak Prescott entered the league as a fourth-round pick, stepped in for an injured Tony Romo, and never gave the starting job back. More recently, Brock Purdy, the last pick of the 2022 NFL Draft, literally known as Mr. Irrelevant, stepped in for the San Francisco 49ers and took them to the NFC Championship game. The league has a history of chaos producing stars, and every front office knows it. That knowledge is precisely what is driving the current conversation around Shedeur Sanders and whether Cincinnati should be the team to bring him in. Shedeur Sanders is not an unknown commodity at this point. He built his reputation at the college level under enormous scrutiny, playing for his father Deion Sanders at Colorado, where the spotlight was brighter and more intense than most college programs ever experience. Early in his career, critics questioned whether he could handle that pressure, whether the attention surrounding his family name would become a distraction rather than a motivation. What happened instead was that Sanders responded to every criticism with performance. He improved his mechanics, demonstrated genuine command of complex offensive systems, and developed the kind of composure under pressure that NFL scouts specifically look for in quarterbacks. His decision-making in the pocket, his ability to go through progressions, and his footwork all showed measurable development. Multiple teams are now evaluating him not as a novelty or a storyline, but as a legitimate quarterback prospect, and insiders who have watched him in practice environments have come away with growing belief in his readiness. Inside Bengals front office discussions, quarterback depth has reportedly become a serious agenda item following Burrow's injury. The playoff math for Cincinnati is straightforward and unforgiving. The team needs at minimum 8 wins to stay in realistic contention, and getting there without a proven starting quarterback is a significant challenge. The current backup options on the roster have not inspired widespread confidence, and the front office is engaged in the kind of due diligence that serious organizations conduct before a crisis forces their hand. Adding Sanders would not simply be a depth move. It would send a message to the locker room, to the rest of the AFC North, and to the broader league, that the Bengals are not willing to sit back and hope for the best while their season slips away. There are salary cap considerations involved in any acquisition, and there is always the difficult conversation about what it signals when a franchise explores options behind its franchise quarterback. But smart football organizations separate sentimentality from strategy, and right now, strategy demands that Cincinnati at least seriously evaluates this option. The Cleveland Browns represent a complicating layer in this entire situation. Sanders was drafted by Cleveland, meaning the Browns have a direct stake in where he lands and how he performs. Joe Flacco has faced early struggles this season, and the Browns' depth chart situation has created internal pressure about their quarterback room. The last thing Cleveland wants is for Sanders to land with a division rival, develop into a genuine contributor, and beat them twice a year in what is already one of the most punishing divisions in football. The AFC North, featuring the Baltimore Ravens, the Pittsburgh Steelers, the Browns, and the Bengals, does not give anyone room for error. Every team in that division watches every other team's roster moves with careful attention, and a Sanders to Cincinnati deal would immediately register as a major competitive development. The Browns' instinct would be to tighten their grip on Sanders rather than allow him to strengthen an opponent in the same division. That dynamic adds real friction to any deal. The Miami Dolphins have entered the conversation as a genuine competing interest, and their presence matters. Miami has dealt with quarterback turbulence early in the season, and the fan base in South Florida has very little patience for mediocrity given the offensive weapons the organization has assembled. The Dolphins run an explosive, speed-based offensive system that could represent an excellent fit for Sanders' skill set. Miami has playmakers at the skill positions who can make any competent quarterback look dangerous, and the urgency within that organization to stabilize the position is real. The Dolphins' interest is not casual. It is the kind of active evaluation that could accelerate into a formal move at any point, and that timeline creates direct pressure on the Bengals. Every day Cincinnati spends deliberating is a day Miami could be moving toward a deal. Competition for a player's services does not keep a polite schedule, and if the Bengals are serious about Sanders, the Dolphins' involvement means hesitation has a measurable cost. The San Francisco 49ers add yet another dimension to this picture. San Francisco is a franchise operating with championship expectations every single season under head coach Kyle Shanahan, and they cannot afford quarterback instability. Brock Purdy's own injury history has created legitimate concern about what happens if the 49ers are forced to operate without their starter for any significant stretch of time. The Shanahan offensive system is sophisticated enough that quarterback fit matters enormously, and Sanders' ability to process quickly and operate within a structured scheme makes him a realistic candidate for what San Francisco would need in a developmental or emergency role. The 49ers have a stacked roster that is genuinely capable of competing for a Super Bowl, and they are not going to watch that window close because they failed to address quarterback depth when the opportunity was in front of them. Their interest in Sanders is driven by the same logic that is driving Cincinnati's: you cannot wait until disaster is already happening before you build insurance. When national voices like Stephen A. Smith begin amplifying a story, the dynamic around that story changes. Media coverage at that level does not just reflect a conversation, it accelerates it and expands it. Public expectations build. Decision-makers who might have been taking a measured approach suddenly find themselves aware that inaction itself is becoming a storyline. Speculation becomes narrative, and narrative creates pressure on front offices to either act or publicly explain why they are not acting. The Sanders situation has reached that level of national attention, and the Bengals are operating in that environment whether they want to or not. Inside the Bengals locker room, the questions are unavoidable. Veteran players who have invested in this team's success have opinions about what direction the franchise should take. Receivers want to know who will be throwing them the ball. The offensive line wants to know whose protection to prioritize. Competition for roster spots sharpens performance, but it can also create division if communication from the coaching staff and front office is not clear and consistent. Any quarterback addition carries the risk of creating uncertainty among players who have committed to the existing structure. Sanders' ability to command respect in a professional environment, not just as a famous name, but as a football player who has earned credibility through work, would be central to how smoothly any transition is managed. Leadership vacuums are dangerous in professional sports, and the Bengals cannot afford one at the most important position on the field. The core tension in this decision is not complicated to articulate, even if it is difficult to resolve. The Bengals believe in Joe Burrow. They have invested in him, built around him, and structured their franchise identity around his development. Bringing in Sanders is not a statement that Burrow is being replaced. It is a statement that intelligent organizations do not leave themselves exposed when the player they depend on most is unavailable for an extended period. 12 to 14 weeks is not a short absence. If Sanders is acquired and develops within the system, the Bengals gain long-term depth flexibility. If he performs under pressure, the conversation about Cincinnati's quarterback future becomes far more interesting than anyone currently expects. If the move is not made and the season collapses without Burrow, the question of why the front office did not act will be very difficult to answer. The league-wide implications of this situation extend beyond Cincinnati. Prime-time matchups, jersey sales, and the AFC North competitive balance are all affected by where Shedeur Sanders lands and how he performs. Every rival front office is watching quietly, calculating how a Sanders addition changes the math within the division. The AFC playoff picture is sensitive enough that one or two key roster decisions can shift multiple teams' fortunes simultaneously. Leverage in the Sanders market is real, and it shifts with every day that passes and every new team that enters the evaluation process. The Bengals were building momentum with 2 strong wins before Joe Burrow's turf toe injury requiring surgery derailed their season, with a 12 to 14-week recovery timeline fundamentally changing the team's contingency planning. Burrow's injury history has made availability, not just talent, a genuine factor in long-term franchise planning for the Bengals. Tom Brady, Kurt Warner, Dak Prescott, and Brock Purdy all emerged from backup or unexpected roles to become legitimate starters and champions, establishing a clear historical pattern the NFL returns to repeatedly. Shedeur Sanders faced significant criticism early in his career but responded with measurable development in mechanics, pocket composure, and offensive system command. Multiple teams are now evaluating Sanders as a legitimate quarterback prospect based on his performance and development, not simply because of his family name. The Bengals need a minimum of 8 wins to stay in realistic playoff contention, and without a proven starter, that target becomes significantly harder to reach. The Cleveland Browns drafted Sanders and have a direct competitive interest in preventing him from landing with a division rival in the AFC North. The Miami Dolphins' active interest in Sanders creates real timeline pressure on Cincinnati, as competition for his services could accelerate at any point. The San Francisco 49ers operate under championship expectations every season and cannot afford quarterback instability given Brock Purdy's own injury history. Kyle Shanahan's offensive system requires a quarterback who can process quickly and operate within a structured scheme, and Sanders fits that profile. Stephen A. Smith's involvement in amplifying the Sanders to Cincinnati conversation elevated it from regional speculation to national narrative, increasing pressure on the Bengals front office. The locker room dynamics surrounding any quarterback addition involve veteran reactions, receiver expectations, and offensive line trust, all of which must be managed carefully to avoid division. Smart franchises build contingency plans before crises force their hands, and standing still while multiple competitors evaluate the same player is a strategy with measurable downside risk. The AFC North, featuring the Ravens, Steelers, Browns, and Bengals, is consistently one of the most competitive divisions in football, where every roster move carries division-wide implications. The broader league impact of a Sanders acquisition would extend to prime-time matchups, jersey sales, and playoff seeding across the entire AFC, making it a decision with consequences far beyond Cincinnati's roster.